January 22nd, 1879. The Buffalo River runs red as the Zulu kingdom collides with the might of the British Empire. At Isandlwana, a disaster for the crown. Over 1,000 British soldiers lay dead. Yet, just miles away, 150 British soldiers made a valiant stand that would be remembered for centuries. Outnumbered 60-1, they braced for a Zulu assault of thousands. Yet, by daybreak, the tiny garrison still stands intact. The battered redcoats trade uncertain glances. How had these soldiers achieved the impossible and survived the night? This is the Battle of Rorke's Drift. The battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift on the 22nd of January 1879 have become synonymous with crushing defeat and gallant defense. Occurring within hours of each other, they were two sides of the same bloody coin. In the middle of the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, the British Army's invasion of Zululand was only days old. On the road between Rorke's Drift on the Buffalo River and the rocky outcrop of Isandlwana, two British officers stopped briefly to confer. It was a fateful meeting. In the space of hours, one would live and one would die. Colonel Anthony Durnford, with a force of cavalry, was heading east to the temporary encampment at Isandlwana. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers had just been to Isandlwana to clarify orders for his engineers detachment. Chard was now returning to Rorke's Drift to continue with the work of improving the crossing point over the Buffalo River. We will never know what was said between the two men. Chard understood from his brief time at Isandlwana that large Zulu forces had been sighted to the north of the camp. He was concerned that the Zulus might bypass the main British force and threaten Rorke's Drift 10 miles to the rear. Chard and Durnford almost certainly discussed this before they parted ways. Within hours, Durnford would be stabbed to death. Chard was to live and would achieve fame in the hours after Durnford's death and the catastrophic Isandlwana defeat. His leadership at the defense of Rorke's Drift was to become a legend. About 20 miles to the east, the British troops under Lord Chelmsford had been chasing Zulu ghosts all day. It was not until increasingly anxious reports from Isandlwana camp reached an intensity that he reluctantly gave the order to return to the camp. Chelmsford arrived at Isandlwana too late to prevent the massacre. In the dusk, the battlefield was a horrific sight. Wagons overturned, collapsed tents, strewn equipment, clothing, and ammunition boxes. Acrid smoke hung in the air. Rifles, spears, and shields littered the ground. Bodies lay huddled in clumps or scattered, betraying desperate last stands or panic-stricken flight. Many wore the red tunics of the 24th Regiment of Foot, and many of the dead had been savagely butchered. Zulu rituals required the stomach of the fallen foe to be slit open to release evil spirits. Stray shots rang out. Some Zulus were still lurking, drunk on medical alcohol or looting. The British killed some, while the others ran off into the gloom. The ashen-faced British commander, Lord Chelmsford, struggled with the scale of the disaster. It's also possible he was already calculating how to avoid the blame for rushing off on a wild goose chase and leaving an inexperienced staff officer in charge of the camp. With night falling, the soldiers feared that Zulu forces were still in the area. They formed up into a tight defensive position area and bedded down for the night. They got no sleep. They lay amid the corpses of comrades. On the horizon to the west, the orange glow of flame and faintly audible gunfire suggested further bad news. The battle at Isandlwana was an unmitigated disaster for the British. It seemed as if the same fate was awaiting their comrades at Rorke's Drift.
Guys, if you're enjoying this video, please give the video a like. Apparently, it really helps the channel grow. Thanks. Let's get back into the video.
Rorke's drift literally meaning a ford, was a shallow crossing point at the Buffalo River, the border between British-held Natal Province and Zululand. On the west side, 2 buildings plus a cookhouse and an outside toilet had once been a trading post owned by an Irishman, James Rorke. Rorke's drift was known to Zulus as Kwajimu, or Jim's Place. When Rorke died, the property was sold and became a Swedish church mission. In January 1979, it was serving as a hospital and a storehouse in support of the British invasion of Zululand. The 2 buildings were 50 yards apart and a mile back from the river. The core of the garrison there comprised 140 men of B Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment of Foot under the command of Major Henry Spaulding. Royal Engineers were operating wooden ferries across the river to facilitate the movement of troops and supplies. There were about 35 men in the hospital, many of whom were not seriously ill. Local native soldiers also assisted with moving supplies. The garrison was perhaps 400 strong. Looming over the buildings was Cheyenne Hill in Zulu, or the Oscarberg to the Europeans. Due east of the buildings, it was 600 feet high. It was covered with scrub, bushes, and rocks, ideal for concealment for men armed with rifles. In the afternoon of the 22nd of January, John Chard, with only a handful of engineers under his own command, by a quirk of fate, found himself in charge of the whole garrison. Spaulding decided to ride to Helpmikar, a staging post for the invasion 10 miles west, to find out about reinforcements for Rorke's drift. Logically, Bromhead, who actually commanded B Company and had some military experience, should have been in charge. However, according to the army list, which recorded length of service rather than military experience, Chard was slightly more senior. Spaulding departed and the garrison resumed routine duties. Just before 3 o'clock, 2 horsemen rode up to the river from the northeast. They were exhausted and in a state of disarray. One was Lieutenant Adendorf, an officer of the Natal Native Horse. He brought the worst possible news. The British camp at Isandlwana had been overrun and destroyed by a powerful Zulu force which was now headed straight for Rorke's drift. Chard and Bromhead hastily confirmed should they stay and fight or retreat to Helpmikar. They decided to withdraw, but the lives of the garrison were almost certainly saved by the intervention of one man. Acting Assistant Commissary James Dalton was in charge of supplies at the camp. Dalton argued that a column of ox-drawn wagons and wounded men moving slowly in open would soon be overtaken by fleet-footed Zulus. They had to stand and fight. The garrison scrambled to prepare defenses. Chard's engineering experience was invaluable. Wagons, bulky boxes of biscuits, and solid sacks of grains were formed into continuous walls linking the 2 buildings. They would fight or die in a rectangle the size of 3 tennis courts. An extra wall of boxes divided the rectangle in 2 in case they were at risk of being overwhelmed. Finally, Chard gave instructions for the construction of a circular redoubt of sacks and boxes 5 yards across to shelter the wounded and to provide an elevated platform for soldiers to fire down on attackers. Firing points were improvised from the windows of the 2 buildings and loopholes hacked out of the clay walls to allow fire to be directed in all directions. The soldiers' tents just outside of the compound were collapsed to prevent the Zulus using them as cover. The native soldiers in the camp vanished. They had no desire to be slaughtered by the Zulu and owed no particular loyalty to the British. But worse, a contingent of Natal Native Horse arrived from the direction of Isandlwana. An officer offered his men to fight with Chard and the garrison, but the horsemen had other plans and rode away before they could be organized. The disgusted soldiers of B Company, realizing they were being abandoned, fired a flurry of shots at the departing horsemen. One trooper fell dead. The first battle casualty had been from friendly fire. Gunshots rang out from the Cheyenne Hill. Chard's preparation time was over. An attack was coming in from the south. Elements of 4 Zulu Impi, about 4,000 warriors in total, were approaching. They were young, excited, and had spent the afternoon in a savage pursuit of the remnants of a British army. As the reserve force at Isandlwana, they had not been committed to battle. The warriors had seen their brothers crush the British and gain the glory. They had not experienced at close hand the terrible carnage caused by a half-inch caliber Martin Henry rifle bullet. They wanted to dip their spears in the blood of the British soldiers. They would ignore Zulu King Ketweyo's order that no one should not cross the Buffalo River and enter British territory. The first Zulu attacks came en masse, fast and confident, from the south. Under the direction of Chard and Bromhead, disciplined volleys of rifle fire brought many of the front ranks of Zulus crashing to the ground. But the attackers pressed forward. They were supported by sniping from the Cheyenne Hill. The snipers had Henry Martini rifles looted from Isandlwana. Although they looked straight down into the camp, the Zulu aim was poor. They were ignorant about the use of the rear sight, believing that elevating it added more power to the shot. The hospital on the southwest corner of the compound proved a weak spot for the defenders. Zulu warriors broke in through windows and doors and even managed to climb onto the thatched roof, which they proceeded to hack into. The straw caught alight during the sustained rifle fire, and some Zulus got into the hospital amid savage room-to-room and hand-to-hand fighting. There was no internal corridor, so the only way to move from room to room was to hack through the interior walls with bayonets and hands. Chard saw that the hospital was untenable. He ordered for the wounded to be evacuated and the hospital to be abandoned. Those soldiers that could escape fell back in the smoke and confusion to the internal defense line of boxes and sacks that Chard had designed for this purpose. More Zulu fighters pressed on, with attacks from the south and the northwest. Because the Rorke's drift position was so small and the Zulu number so great, the Zulus struggled to deploy their full force at any one time. There was only space for a certain number in the front, crowding and jostling, while the others had to follow up from behind, unable to get to grips with the British until the front ranks had been shot down. The organized fire of Martini Henry rifles at short range cut down swathes of warriors. Unlike Isandlwana, the soldiers were close to the ammunition supplies. Injured soldiers helped reload guns and distribute ammunition. The grain sacks, boxes, wagons and walls were proving insurmountable to the Zulus. Furthermore, the Zulus did not relish the long British bayonets fixed to their rifles. It gave the British a 2-foot advantage against the shorter Zulu assegai. Rebuffed at high cost from the south and northwest, the Zulus tried again from the east. This time, they got very close, breaking into a cattle kraal and a small building adjacent to the improvised defenses. The unflinching British soldiers delivered continuous, well-aimed fire, and again, the Zulus retired, leaving dead and dying in their wake. As night fell, only the flames crackling in the hospital illuminated the battlefield. To Chard, Bromhead, and the exhausted soldiers, it seemed as if the Zulu were retiring. Dark figures flitted away into the shadows, leaving bodies groaning or silent, stretched out on the dusty ground behind them. The gunfire died away for lack of targets, although random pot shots punctuated the darkness. It was an uneasy night, and nobody slept. There was time to replenish ammunition, gulp a few swigs of water to wash down mouthfuls of hard biscuit and bully beef. When dawn broke, the soldiers were already at full alert, expecting another attack. All was silent. Chard sent a rider to help Mikar to hasten the reinforcements. Cautious patrols were sent out, soldiers cleared away Zulus' spears, shields, and other weapons from the battlefield to ensure the Zulus had no undue advantage if they attacked again. A large body of Zulus was seen in the distance, but they showed no appetite for confrontation and disappeared. Shocked by the casualties and exhausted and starving from several days of combat and movement across harsh terrain, the Zulus were spent physically and mentally. At 7 in the morning, Chelmsford's force arrived from the northeast to the intense relief of all. But there was little celebration. Some Zulu prisoners were shot dead in cold blood by Chelmsford's men. No one knew what the Zulu plan was, but a large attack into Natal seemed likely. Chelmsford's force departed hastily into Natal, leaving a couple of artillery pieces at the drift, but little in the way of orders or other support. The action at Rorke's Drift should never have happened, but it has long since passed into legend. The British government needed a distraction from the Isandlwana catastrophe and hyped up the importance of the action. 150 men defeated 4,000 Zulu, killing around 350 for the loss of 17 British. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, including Chard and Bromhead, the most received by one regiment in a day. Some senior army officers later grumbled about the amount of awards dished out, but this should not take away from the bravery of the men involved.